Hey, welcome back. Here's a trivia question for you. Which NFL player has 2 Super Bowl rings, 1 Super Bowl MVP, and has been named the NFL's most valuable player 5 times, the Offensive Player of the Year twice, the Comeback Player of the Year once, received the Walter Payton NFL Man of the Year award, was named to the AP First Team All-Pro 7 times, the Pro Bowl 14 times, led the league in passing yards 3 times and touchdowns 4 times, and still holds the NFL single-season record for touchdowns, passing yards, and yards per game? If you guessed Tom Brady, you'd be incorrect. That also means you're not welcome here. Like, seriously, I'm not joking. Go! And don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Now that we have the degenerates out of here, I'm sure the rest of you chose correctly: Peyton Manning. Over his 19-year career, the Sheriff garnered countless accolades, though there were definitely some ups and downs. Who could forget his rookie season, where Manning threw 26 touchdowns and 28 interceptions? Yikes. In 2003, Manning would lead the league in passing yards, completion percentage, and yards per game, and be named the most valuable player by the Associated Press. Despite these numbers, Manning and the Colts would fall to the New England Patriots in the AFC Championship game 24-14 after being shut out in the first half. Manning would throw for 237 yards, 1 touchdown, and 4 interceptions that evening. Manning came into the 2004 season looking for revenge, and just obliterated his competition. He led the league with 49 touchdown passes, breaking Dan Marino's single-season record that had stood since 1984. That year, Manning completed 336 passes, which means that every time he dropped back to pass, he had a 1 in 10 chance of throwing a touchdown. That's just ridiculous. Manning would lead the Colts to a 12-4 record, winning the division and be named league MVP for the second year in a row, win his first AP Offensive Player of the Year award, but would fall again to the Patriots in the playoffs with another subpar performance of 238 yards and an interception. By now, the narrative around Manning was starting to crystallize into being unstoppable in the regular season, but unable to pull it out when it mattered most. Jumping forward to 2006, Manning again led the league in touchdowns with 31 and another 12-4 record to win the division. It seemed like these playoffs were do or die for the Colts, and they came out swinging, punching the Chiefs in the teeth 23-8, then beating the Ravens 15-6 to advance to the AFC Championship. Against the Chiefs, Manning would throw for 268 yards, 1 touchdown, and 3 interceptions, and would follow that up with 170 yards and 2 interceptions against the Ravens. Again, it looked like Manning and the Colts were destined to fail upward and get stomped by the Patriots, who they just so happened to meet in the conference championship game the next week. Now, I don't think I need to tell anyone here the story of the 2006 AFC Championship game, but for the uninitiated, the Colts were down 21-6 at the end of the first half, that included a pick 6 by Manning midway through the second quarter. Now, I don't know what Tony Dungy did in the locker room during that halftime, or if he got a hold of some of Michael's secret stuff, but the Colts came out of the locker room a different team, with Manning leading the charge. They started with a quick drive capped by a 1-yard run by Manning, of all people, to start the rally. The Colts followed that up with maybe my all-time favorite play in Colts history, a late third-quarter touchdown pass to linebacker Dan Klecko. We love big man touchdowns in this house. 88 caught himself the 2-point conversion that knotted up at 21, and now we had a ball game. The rock fight commenced, including a Pats touchdown, followed by an offensive scoop and score by Colts center Jeff Saturday. Man, this game had everything. Followed by some punts and a late field goal to put New England back up by 3 with 2 minutes 27 seconds left in the game. Manning stepped up, and under the lights of the RCA Dome, rewrote history by leading his team with 58 passing yards in 26 seconds to set up Joseph Addai for the go-ahead touchdown. The win sealed poetically by a Brady interception to send the Colts to their first Super Bowl since 1970 and capping off the biggest conference championship game comeback in league history. From there, Manning would lead the Colts to a Super Bowl victory in Miami, defeating Da Bears 29-17, and be named Super Bowl MVP. Finally, the narrative had been flipped. Now, this is just a small sample of what Peyton Manning's illustrious career of 18 seasons has to offer, and I haven't even touched on his comeback after surgery and his tenure in Denver. But nonetheless, I believe, with my entire heart and soul, that Peyton Manning is the greatest quarterback of all time. And as stated previously, I will die on this hill. I was recently rewatching the fantastic secret-based documentary Captain Ahab, the story of Dave Stieb, the Toronto Blue Jays pitcher who has a very legitimate case to be the greatest pitcher of the 1980s and deserving of a spot in the Baseball Hall of Fame. It is so hard to try and quantify a player's value or greatness, but one metric the fine men and women over at Secret Base used to argue their case for Steve was WAR, or wins above replacement. To borrow their definition of the value, WAR is an estimation of how many more wins a team has because they have this guy on the team instead of some replacement-level bozo. It offers a more complete reflection of his accomplishments in retrospect. And while I was rewatching this fantastic documentary, please go watch it if you haven't already, I could not stop thinking about WAR for a totally different league. Now, I have gone on record as not being a fan of arguments about who is the GOAT or greatest of all time for this league or that, but that shouldn't stop us from trying. Now shut up. This video isn't about the GOAT paint banning, but it is about GOATs. While I don't much care for arguing about GOATs in real life, I am interested in looking into who the greatest Benny Bowl Football League players of all time are, and the impact they left. This is math. More specifically, it is a formula used to calculate the WAR for fantasy football players, as developed by the good people at Dynasty Nerds. I know this kind of math may put some of you guys to sleep, so to keep your interest, I provided Bob Sanders highlights for your viewing pleasure. As we said, WAR estimates how many wins above replacement a player provided to his or her team compared to the average replacement-level player at the same position. First, we need to calculate the average points each skill position player scored on average per week, or points per game. We use the top 12 or 24 skilled position players for this estimation, which assumes the top 12 quarterbacks, 24 wide receivers, 24 running backs, and 12 tight ends are started every week in a standard 12-team league. Next, through some algebraic trickery, we need to compare the average points per game your team would score with any certain position player versus a team that scores the average points per game of the league. For example, in 2024, Lamar Jackson scored an average of 35.8 points per game, while the average QB points per game was 27.63, a difference of 8.17 points per game. The average points per game per team in the BBFL in 2024 was 130.6. So all things being equal, someone with Lamar Jackson on their team should expect to score an average of 138.8 points per game. Next, we need to calculate the odds that Lamar Jackson's 8.17 points per game above average will beat an opponent's score that week. We call this the win percent chance, of which Lamar Jackson had a .898 in 2024, which means that just by starting Lamar Jackson, you had an 89% chance of winning any individual fantasy matchup, all other things being equal. Oh, and don't worry about that norm dist in the equation. That stands for normal distribution, which is just a really nerdy way to calculate the probability that a variable x falls at or below a specified value. We use the win percent chance to calculate a player's seasonal win value, which is a rough estimate number of games won due to said player. It's calculated by multiplying a player's win percent chance by number of games played, which gives Lamar Jackson a seasonal win value of 11.7. From here, you can calculate WAR, or wins above replacement, by subtracting the replacement level seasonal win value at that position from the player you are looking at. For Lamar Jackson, that comes to a WAR of 8.7, or 8.7 more games won that season versus an average starter just by starting Jackson in your lineup. Confused? Too bad. Moving on. If you're still awake, I'm sure you can tell where I'm going with this. Let's use WAR to look at the BBFL and find its greatest of all time players. Not only that, let's see who each manager's best players were, who could be argued to be their GOAT, and look at the top 10 greatest BBFL players of all time. The entire Excel sheet is available below to download for the curious. Former league members have been filtered out of the annual top reports, but may still be seen in the stats columns, along with some fun and helpful charts. Okay, enough stalling. Let's get into it. Before we get into the top 10 all-time BBFL players, I wanted to go through our managers who don't have a player on the top 10 list and highlight their greatest players of all time. We're going to run through this in ascending order of each manager's GOATs wins above replacement, starting with Noah Slagle. This is a little unfair since his sample size is the smallest in the league, but what are you going to do? Names in bold indicate it was the manager's rookie season with the BBFL. Noah only had 2 position players crack the top 12 or 24 this season, but the rest of his top 5 list will fill out eventually. Noah's all-time greatest player, thus far, is Jonathan Taylor with a WAR of 3.6. Taylor rushed for 1,431 yards across 14 games, scoring 11 touchdowns and averaging 102 yards per game, the 3rd highest in the league that year. He was also selected for a 2nd Pro Bowl and was the 10th best WAR for running backs. Next up, we have Kayla Thorpe. Kayla is in a similar boat to Noah, possessing a smaller pool of players to put on her top 5 list. Kayla has rostered such names as A.J. Brown, Baker Mayfield, Dak Prescott, and Jalen Hurts in her short tenure with the league, but her all-time best player, so far at least, was Davante Adams in 2022 with a WAR 6.8. Adams had an even 100 receptions for 1,516 yards, third highest in the season, and 14 touchdowns, which led the league for wide receivers that year. He would be named to the AP First Team All-Pro for the third time of his career and make it to the Pro Bowl for the sixth year in a row, which all adds up to the third best wide receiver WAR in 2022. Most importantly, Adams would help lead Kayla to a playoff berth in her very first season with the BBFL. Up next is the legendary Nicholas Holmes, who... Hold on. Does anybody see Nick's stats? Oh, wait, I know. Hold on, 1 second. There we go. Forgot we had an extra special spot for Nick's stats. Let me try that again. Up next is the legendary Nicholas Holmes, who somehow didn't crack our top 10 all-time list. Nick's greatest player of all time is Cooper Kupp, who in 2021 posted a WAR of 8.1, a full 2 games above replacement than his next closest competition, Davante Adams. I think we all remember this season from Kupp. 145 receptions for 1,947 receiving yards and 16 touchdowns, the league high in all 3 categories. Kupp averaged a league-leading 114 yards per game on his way to his first Pro Bowl, AP Offensive Player of the Year, Super Bowl victory, Super Bowl MVP, and, supremely, BBFL MVP. And while Cooper Kupp failed to crack our league's top 10 all-time list, the same cannot be said for his manager, Nicholas Holmes. In his 5 short years with the BBFL, Nick made it to the Benny Bowl twice, winning it in 2022, as well as the regular season championship, and being named Manager of the Year. He was named Rookie of the Year in 2019 and Most Improved in 2022 on his way to Benny Bowl 11. He was a divisional champion twice and took home the All-Sports Championship in 2023. He was also the BBFL Minor League Champion in 2018, BBBL and BBF1 Champion in 2023, and was the sole inductee into the BBFL Hall of Fame class of 2023. And while you may not believe me after over 2,000 of them, I'm not always great with words. But if you'd allow me, I'd like to finish with this. Thomas Edison's last words were, "It's very beautiful over there." I don't know where there is, but I hope Nick is kicking ass in fantasy there as well. Rest easy, friend. Up next on our list is one half of those rascally Buchanan boys. Is he the better or worse half? That's up to you to decide. Sound off in the comments below. Anyway, looking over Bryce's top 5 of all time list, you'll see some familiar faces, including who will be the number 1, Josh Allen, who in 2022 had a WAR of 8.2. Allen threw for 4,283 yards and 14 touchdowns, a tie for the second most in the league that year. He added 762 yards on the ground along with 7 more touchdowns and was selected for his second Pro Bowl. Despite all this, Allen's performance was only the 3rd best WAR that year, but we'll get into that later. Kelsey Kemp and her squad of champions are up next, led by the likes of Lamar Jackson, Davante Adams in 2020 and 2021, and Joe Burrow. But it is Saquon Barkley who stands atop Kelsey's list of all-time greats with a WAR of 8.3 in 2024. Saquon led the league in rushing attempts and yards per game at 345 and 125 respectively, as well as yards from scrimmage with 2,283. Most impressive was his 2,005 yards on the ground, only the 9th time this feat has been achieved and only the 2nd time in the last 10 years. Saquon was selected for the Pro Bowl team for a 3rd time, was named the AP Offensive Player of the Year, won the Super Bowl, and was named BBFL MVP. Fly, Goblins, fly. Despite being a part of the league from its founding, 06 mainstay Dr. Michael Stu Stewart has yet to have a player crack the top 10 all-time list. He's gotten close, managing the likes of Austin Eckler in 2021, Danny Woodhead, DeMarco Murray, Alfred Morris, and the greatest weasel to ever wield a whacking stick, Austin Eckler again, who in 2022 posted a WAR of 8.6. The objectively very handsome Eckler rushed for 915 yards and 13 touchdowns, the latter of which was a tie for 2nd most in the league, while adding 722 yards through the air and an additional 5 touchdowns to bump up his stats. But let me ask you a question. Would you rather have 3 Benny Bowls or a top 10 all-time player? That's what I thought. Finally, we have the other half of those rascally Buchanan boys, Ian Buchanan. Ian has seen lots of success in recent years, which reflects in his top 5 list here. But for his greatest of all time, we have to jump back a decade to 2015 for Brandon Marshall's first season as a New York Jet, with a WAR of 8.6. Marshall ran for 1,502 yards and 14 touchdowns, the latter the league high mark, and would be selected for his 6th career Pro Bowl. Brandon Marshall also led Ian's squad to victory over Stu in Benny Bowl 4, in which he would be named Benny Bowl MVP, and would go on to be named to the BBFL Hall of Fame class of 2021. Fun fact, Ian's Benny Bowl 4 win ties Benny Bowl 1 for the lowest overall scoring championship in league history, as well as the second lowest scoring Benny Bowl champion in league history. Sorry, Ian. No shade intended, just something I noticed while writing the script. Okay, here we are, the home stretch. From here on out, we will be looking at the top 10 greatest BBFL players of all time, in order of their wins above replacement. Rolling in at number 10 is a familiar face, Lamar Jackson in 2024. Way back in the equations and Bob Sanders section of this film, we saw Jackson post a WAR of 8.7, a win and a half ahead of the next QB this season. Jackson threw for 4,172 yards and 41 touchdowns, a tie for the second most in the league. He rushed for over 900 yards and added 4 more touchdowns on the ground. He was named AP Offensive Player of the Year as well to his 4th Pro Bowl, and was Benny Bowl 13 runner-up. Jackson averaged 35.8 fantasy points per game this year, 7 more points per game than the league average, and was just miles ahead of his competition, as you can see here. Only 3 other players broke the 8 wins above barrier in 2024. Putting it all together, this performance constitutes the greatest by any unicorn to ever grace the fantasy field for Michael Makita. Congratulations. Unfortunately, number 9 on our list is a face equal parts familiar as it is ugly. In 2021, Thomas, Edward, Patrick, Satan, Brady, Jr. had the 9th greatest season in BBFL history while playing for Sam King. Satan completed 485 passes for 5,316 yards and 43 touchdowns, averaging 312 yards per game, leading the league in all 4 stats. Brady's 5,316 passing yards still stands as the 3rd highest in a single season. He would be selected for his 15th Pro Bowl and was 2nd in AP MVP voting behind Aaron Rodgers. But don't fret, I do have some good news here. In real life, Brady and his new team, the Buccaneers, would lose in the NFC Divisional Playoff round, while in the BBFL playoffs would anchor Sam's number 1 seeded All Hail the King that would be upset in the first round to Tuxanity, posting only 5 points in his big game. Never mess with devil magic. Dust off those history books, because these next few will be the... Oh. Well, this is awkward. Good thing I always have a plan B. Dust off those history books, because these next few will be the names you've not heard in a long time players. Number 8 on our list jumps back to 2016, when my 2nd greatest player of all time, David Johnson, rushed for 1,239 yards and 16 touchdowns, the 2nd most in the league. Johnson added 879 receiving yards and 4 aerial touchdowns on top of that, averaging 24.7 fantasy points per game, all to post a WAR of 9.0 wins above replacement. For comparison, the next most productive back that year was Ezekiel Elliott, who averaged 20 fantasy points per game and had a WAR of just 7.4. Compared to his competition in 2016, Johnson had none. I can now admit that this was the one and only season that I didn't really put my all into the BBFL season. Can't remember why. It was my senior year of undergrad, but come on, that's no excuse. Luckily, Johnson isn't my GOAT, so let's continue. Before discussing James's GOAT, let's take a quick detour and explain what I like to call Jameslation. These are the rushing and receiving scoring rules for the BBFL as of the 2025 season, unchanged since 2018 with the sole exception of the rushing first down bonus of 1 point in the 2024 season. While our league used to get bonuses for 100 and 200 yard performances or touchdown catches of over 40 or 50 yards, the core scoring means of touchdowns, conversions, and receptions has remained steady through the league's existence. Now, may I direct your attention to our third chart, quarterbacks. A little messier, huh? In the league's early years, ball slingers were rewarded fewer points for touchdowns, their primary means of production, while also penalized in different manners than today for acts such as interceptions and sacks, their primary means to lose points. If we look at the 2012 and 2013 seasons, we see that touchdowns were worth 4 points, while interceptions took away 2 points. 2014 saw the touchdown value jump to 6 points, and interceptions drop to -4, along with the introduction of a 1-point deduction for a sack. In 2015, we dropped a sack even further down to -2, but then in 2017, we brought both sacks and interceptions up a point to -1 and -3 respectively. And outside the bonuses for X number of yards or touchdowns over 40 yards, this is how scoring has worked for quarterbacks for the better part of a decade. Why bring this up? I'm glad you asked. In 2013, there were 804 passing touchdowns thrown in the regular season, which, incidentally, means there were 804 receiving touchdowns. Taken at their base value, that would mean that quarterbacks scored, via touchdowns alone, 3,612 fantasy points, as compared to 4,824 points by receivers, meaning receivers scored 1.5 times the points compared to those who slung them the rock, for the exact same result. Thus, enter Jamesflation. In order to balance out the league's early era of passers, I went back and looked over their touchdown, sack, and interception numbers, and inflated or deflated their scores to reflect modern BBFL scoring. As you can see here, there were non-negligible differences in values in 2012, 2013, and 2015, at least to my eyeballs. I'd show you the difference in top 10 before and after taking Jamesflation into account, but that would give away too many surprises. But I won't leave you hanging. The unadjusted top 10 all-time list is included in the Excel sheet linked below under the Jamesflation tab. We now return to our regularly scheduled broadcast. At number 7 on our hallowed list is the wildest of all stallions to ever take the field. James's GOAT is Jamal Charles, all the way back in 2013, when he rushed for 1,287 yards, third highest in the league, 12 touchdowns, a tie for a league high, and averaged 85 yards per game, third highest in the NFL that season. Charles was selected to his third Pro Bowl in 2013 and would help the Fighting Woodchucks get to the semifinals of the Screw You Rex Ryan playoffs. Jamal led all running backs with 18.4 fantasy points per game, a full 2 points per game ahead of Shady McCoy, and was only outscored by Phillip Rivers, Drew Brees, and Peyton Manning in 2013, across the entire fantasy league, as a running back. And we all know how 2013 went for Peyton Manning. But back to Charles, whose WAR of 9.3 was a full win above replacement ahead of McCoy, cementing his spot in BBFL history. Number 6 on our list takes us to 2015, and the greatest Pokepun representative ever. Hold on. No. I can't do this. Not a Megatron's butthole. No, I refuse. How about where he played in college? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, let's try that. Okay, let's try that again. Number 6 on our list takes us to 2015, and the greatest Pokepun representative ever. Damn it! No, no, I can't do it here either. Okay. Let me think. Thinking. High school. Yeah, let's try his high school. And okay, perfect. This I can work with. Number 6 on our list takes us to 2015, and the greatest Pokepun representative I've ever managed, Julio Jones, and his WAR of 9.6. Jones caught 136 balls for 1,871 yards, both numbers leading the league. He only scored 8 touchdowns, somehow, but also led the league with 116 yards per game and was runner-up in non-QB fantasy points per game at 23.1. The third-round pick of the Poke franchise, Jones was the cornerstone of the Umbreon squad that would win 10 games, claim the divisional and regular season championships, as well as the number 1 seed, but was also part of maybe the greatest BBFL playoff upset in history. That one still stings, though not as much as 2016 probably stung for Jones, Julio scored over 2 more fantasy points per game than his next closest receiver, Brandon Marshall, with a WAR a full game ahead of him as well. What a squandered year for Jones and the Umbreon, but still, one of legend. Number 5 on our list takes us back to 2015, and one of the buffest little boys Chase ever managed, Antonio Brown, and his WAR of 9.729. Brown caught 136 balls for 1,834 yards, the highest and second highest in the league. He only scored 10 touchdowns somehow, but also nearly led the league with 114 yards per game and was the top non-QB fantasy point scorer per game at 23.9. Hold on. This sounds familiar. Doesn't this sound a lot like... Yeah, Julio Jones in the same season. Hold on. That can't be right. Let's go to the board. Son of a bitch. They had the same number of receptions, the league high. Jones had 1,871 yards, but that's only 37 more than Brown. They averaged the same catches per game, and basically the same yardage per game. The only real difference was touchdowns, where Brown got ahead of Jones by 2. But, how could it be that close? Oh. Well, damn. Real tale of two cities, huh? Through 8 games in 2015, Julio led the race with 70 catches, 892 yards, and 6 touchdowns, to Brown's 52 catches, 718 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Games 9 through 16 totally flipped the script, with Brown pulling in 84 catches for 1,116 yards and 7 touchdowns, to Jones's 66 catches, 979 yards, and a measly 2 touchdowns. Brown was ice cold from week 3 through 8, then blasted off with 2 touchdown games and 2 games over 180 yards, kicked off by a monstrous 284 yards off 13 catches against the Raiders in week 9. That tracks. Julio, meanwhile, went cold in the back half of 2015, not pulling in another score until week 15 after Brown had already blown past him. And yet, at the end of the day, they were virtually identical in the fantasy department, their final difference only being 12 points. Which is 2 touchdowns. Benny works in mysterious ways, doesn't she? Number 4 on our list was a long time coming. With a WAR of 9.734, the 4th greatest performance in BBFL history, and Ryan Tucker's 2nd greatest player of all time, is the one and only Peyton Manning. In 2013, Manning had arguably the most dominant quarterback season in NFL history, breaking the league record for both passing yards with 5,477 and touchdowns with 55, both of which are still standing to this day. He led the league with 342 yards per game and threw 7 touchdowns in the first game of the season. Let's pause and put all this into perspective. First, let's look at Manning's touchdown total. In the history of the NFL, a quarterback has thrown for 40 or more touchdowns 22 times. That number drops to 8 for 45 or more touchdowns, and just 3 for 50 or more in a single season, becoming not only the single person to surpass 50 touchdowns, he did it back when there were still just 16 games in a season, and by 5 whole touchdowns. Next, let's take a look at Manning's 5,477 passing yards. Only 15 quarterbacks have ever passed the 5,000-yard mark in a single NFL season. That number shrinks to just 10 to surpass the 5,100-yard mark, and further still to 6 to throw for more than 5,200 yards. Only 3 have made it past 5,300 yards, and only 2 have ever passed 5,400 yards. Manning and Drew Brees in 2011, who threw for 5,476 yards, which Manning would beat by a single yard. And, once again, Manning achieved this in a 16-game season. Of the top 10 all-time single-season passing yard totals, all but 2 were achieved in the 16-game era. Looking at you, 2022 Mahomes and 2021 Brady. Next, on to yards per game. Only 5 quarterbacks in NFL history can say they averaged more than 325 yards per game, and only 2 amongst them can say they broke the 330 mark. 2011 Breeze, and Manning here in 2013. Finally, a note on Peyton's season opener. Manning's 7-touchdown game was the 8th ever such instance in NFL history, and is one of only 3 since the AFL-NFL merger. And in case you were curious, there have only been 47 times in NFL history where a quarterback has thrown for 6 or more touchdowns, 18 of which happened before the merger, leaving just 29 such instances in modern NFL history. Rare air indeed. The Sheriff was selected for his 13th Pro Bowl and won his 5th AP MVP and 2nd Offensive Player of the Year awards, scoring an average of 30.5 fantasy points per game in a year with the average of 18.7. Manning was a dominating force for Ryan and Team Tucker. Can you guess who the next quarterback up was in 2013? Please input your answers now. Ready? It was Drew Brees, who averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game and had a WAR of 7.6, who was also on Ryan's team. Need further convincing? Just look at this graph. Peyton is soaring a mile above his competition here, pun very much intended, with no quarterbacks within 2 wins above replacement or 7 points per game of him. The only quarterback I can find with this kind of separation, minus one in particular that I'm leaving out for reasons, is Patrick Mahomes in 2018. And that's only because the rest of the league's QBs were pretty pedestrian by comparison, not to mention the lack of one Josh Allen to rival Mahomes' talents quite yet. Truly a legendary season by Manning, which sadly ended with Team Tucker as the runner-up and been able to my totalitarian Tokatics. Which, given the current political landscape, maybe I should consider dropping that adjective from our championship banner.
Dixie Chick style.
I know you just stepped down from the dais, Tuck, but get your butt back up here. Your greatest player of all time, and the 3rd greatest performance in BBFL history, belongs to none other than all-day himself, Adrian Peterson. Way back in the inaugural season for the BBFL, AD posted a WAR of 9.9 wins above replacement, and just bowled over his competition. Peterson led the league with 2,097 rushing yards, the 2nd most all-time in a single season in NFL history. Joining the 2,000-yard club is an especially rare feat. AP was only the 7th man to ever break the 2K mark, and only the 3rd to do so in the 21st century. Peterson punished the league's defenses, averaging 131 yards per game on the ground, the league high by over 30 yards, which is only the 5th time in NFL history a back has averaged over 130 yards per game, and the first to do it since Eric Dickerson in 1984. His yards per attempt averaged out to 6, which was the best in the league by any running back, and second only to RG3's 6.8, though Peterson had about 3 times as many carries as Griffin to bring down that average. All Day took it to the house 12 times, a tie for 3rd best in the league, and was named the AP MVP and Offensive Player of the Year, a first for both awards, along with being named to his 5th Pro Bowl. AP helped Team Tucker to the Screw You Rex Ryan semifinals, where he would fall to eventual champion Chase and the Don't Judge Me I'm Buff squad. In a season where running backs were averaging just over 11 fantasy points per game, Peterson was averaging 18.6, the highest by any non-throwing position player. He was even beating the majority of that year's QB crop. He straight up was outscoring Tony Romo, Matthew Stafford, Andrew Luck, Andy Dalton, and Joe Flacco, and was basically even with Cam Newton, RG3, and Matt Ryan. Not to mention, his wins above replacement of 9.9 was higher than anybody in the league and would be the BBFL high mark until the 2015 season. One of the all-time greatest performances for a running back is a pretty good way to kick off a fledgling fantasy football league, huh?
We're staying here in the mid-teens for number 2 all-time on our top 10 list. In 2015, Chase Thorpe saw his buffest of all buff men when, oh, not you again. Typical Falcons. Okay, hold on. Where'd he play in college? Oh, that's easy. Got it. Let's try that again.
We're staying here in the mid-teens for number 2 all-time on our top 10 list. In 2015, Chase Thorpe saw his buffest of all buffmen, Devonta Freeman, pounded his way to a WAR of 10.21, one of only 2 players in league history to break the 10 wins barrier. Freeman rushed for 1,056 yards, which ranked for 7th overall in the league. That seems low. Maybe a visual aid will help? Nope. He's smack dab in the middle of the pack here. Anyway, Freeman would take the rock across the line 11 times, a tie for the best in the league, with 4 other backs. Huh. He averaged just over 70 yards on the ground per game across 15 contests, ranking 8th in the league? Okay, come on. This can't be right. Did I miss something? Is my math off? Oh god, please don't let my math be off. I mean, here he is at the top of the charts for wide receivers in 2015. 303 fantasy points to his name. Well ahead of Peterson, Martin, and everyone else ahead of him rushing. What could it be? Wait. I think I got it. One sec. Let me crunch some numbers. Carry the 1 and... well, there's your problem. In addition to his numbers on the ground, Freeman had 73 receptions for 578 yards to the air, far surpassing his competition in the running back category. I mean, look at this. That's over 100 yards of separation from Miller or Forte, not to mention the 3 extra touchdowns he caught. Let's look at this another way. Remember this graph from before? Yeah, there's Freeman. He's been here the whole time. Once we look at Freeman and his competition in terms of total scrimmage, this makes total sense. Sure, Peterson, Martin, and McFadden were better than Freeman in terms of yards on the ground, but Freeman made up for that by going tit for tat with them on touchdowns. Meanwhile, Freeman dominated his fellow running backs through the air, nearly doubling the receiving yards of his closest competitors while adding 3 touchdowns to his total for the season. All that adds up to Freeman finishing 4th overall in yards from scrimmage in 2015, but leading the pack with 14 total touchdowns alongside Brandon Marshall and Allen Robinson, who had to do it all via airmail. Let's return to this wonderful graph, where you'll see Freeman ahead of all fantasy-relevant position players in 2015. While he may rank 18th overall in fantasy points per game, you have to remember that A, he did that in just 15 games played, 2 of which he didn't even start, and B, the wide receiver room in 2015 was far more competitive than their land-based counterparts. Consider this. In 2015, 11 fantasy viable wide receivers, or nearly half the field, was scoring above the average fantasy points per game of 16.39. 13 players were above or within 1 point per game, so now we're over half the league's viable wideouts. And the league's best, Jones and Brown, were averaging 23.1 and 23.9 points per game respectively, or 6.71 and 7.51 points above the average, respectively. Compare that to the running back room, and you'll see Freeman was averaging 18.9 points per game, or 7.04 points ahead of the average, against a running back field with 10 players with average points per game greater than the mean, or 15 when you include those within 1 point of the average. What's any of this got to do with Freeman and his WAR of 10.21? Well, I would argue that, despite not having the raw numbers in any singular category outside of total touchdowns, the weakness of the running back field in 2015 in comparison to the wide receivers is measurable and allowed for Freeman to be worth more wins above some replacement level bozo than Jones or Brown. Let me try and show you one more way. It'll be quick, I promise. We're actually going to dive deep into these in a few minutes, but right now I have to bust out all reliable standard deviations. To keep it short, standard deviation helps to visualize how much of an outlier any value is in a given set of data. The more standard deviations your value has, the less likely the probability it has to happen. Looking over those who, on paper, seem to have a better claim to the number 2 all-time player in BBFL history, Jones and Brown top the chart with standard deviations of 2.12 and 2.35, respectively. About 95% of all values in a set will fall within 2 standard deviations, so Jones and Brown are indeed outliers. But take a look at Freeman. He is, essentially, at 3 whole standard deviations, which is just on the fringes of the 99.7% of all possible values range. Just take it from me. Freeman's serviceable performance on the ground, coupled with the value he brought catching balls as well, is just enough to get him over the line and ahead of the likes of Jones and Brown. And in the end, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter who's leading after 99.7% of the game, just the last 0.3%. Insert Pacers win probability chart here.
For our number 1 all-time BBFL player, we finally return to this decade. In 2022, Sam King's greatest player of all time, as well as the BBFL's, posted a WAR of 10.24. Could you take a wild guess? The greatest player in BBFL history, and I'm sorry to tell you this, James, is Patrick Mahomes. That season, Mahomes threw for 5,250 yards, leading the league and accumulating the 4th most yards in a season in NFL history, though it did take 17 games to accomplish. Mahomes threw for 41 touchdowns and averaged over 300 yards per game, league highs in both stats. He is voted AP MVP and selected for his 5th Pro Bowl, and would go on to win Super Bowl 57 against the Philadelphia Eagles. Mahomes' real-life performances weren't enough to elevate Sam's squad past the first round of the BBFL playoffs, despite putting up 43 fantasy points, throwing for 336 yards and 3 total touchdowns. In 2022, Mahomes was averaging 33.8 fantasy points per game, 4.5 more than Josh Allen, and 9 full points ahead of the league average. His WAR of 10.24 was 2 full games above replacement than Josh Allen, and was clearly just way ahead of his competition in 2022. Not convinced this belongs at number 1? Let's take a sample. Here are 4 standout BBFL seasons for quarterbacks: 2013, 2018, 2022, and this past season of 2024. 2013's leader is Peyton Manning, with his number 4 all-time performance of a WAR of 9.7, followed by Drew Brees with a WAR of 7.6 and an average points per game for quarterbacks of 18.68. Manning averaged over 30 fantasy points that season, nearly 12 more than the league average, and 6.9, nice, more than Drew Brees. Standout season, right? Well, if we look at our other quote-unquote top quarterbacks in 2013, only Phillip Rivers scored ahead of the league average, and only Manning and Brees were scoring more than 20 points per game. Even if Manning only threw 50 touchdowns, he'd still finish that year with a WAR of 9.4. 45 touchdowns still nets him a WAR of 8.9, both of which are still far ahead of Brees at 7.6, and top 10 all-time BBFL performances in their own right. Hell, take away 15 of his touchdowns, and Manning's WAR is still 8.2, which would be 18th overall in BBFL history, and still half a point ahead of Brees. Maybe the best season a quarterback has ever had? Yeah. The number 1 fantasy season in BBFL history? Not quite. Sorry, Sheriff. Next, we'll look at Mahomes' first year as a starter in 2018. Mahomes had a WAR of 6.9, nice, with the next closest quarterback being old Big Ben Roethlisberger with his WAR of 4.2. The league average for quarterbacks in 2018 was 27.28 points per game. Mahomes averaged 35.9, Roethlisberger 30.3, along with 2 others averaging more than 29 per game. While Mahomes averaged 8.62 more points against the average, Roethlisberger wasn't really that far behind with 3.02 more per game. You may also notice the absence of Josh Allen from this list. Does that absence correlate to Mahomes' distance from the group? That may be conjecture, but this is my video, so I can say what I want. Either way, when 5 of your 12 viable quarterbacks are above the league average, even a fantastic season from Mahomes struggles to pull away in the wins above replacement department. Let's leapfrog 2022 and the 2024, where Jackson was far and away the best man behind center, averaging 35.8 points per game and a WAR of 8.7. The average points per game this season was 27.63, which means Jackson was scoring 8 more points per game than the average quarterback every single week. The only person in the same solar system was Josh Allen, who averaged 31.8 points per game and finished with a WAR of 6.7. Allen was scoring over 4 more points per game above the position's average. Jackson was double that. Want an even mathier, nerdier explanation? You asked for it. It's time to bring up standard deviations. Don't worry, we won't go too deep into the weeds. For those who don't remember from math class, myself included, here's a quick recap. Standard deviations describe how close a set of values are to the average. The lower the standard deviation, the closer it is to the average. 68% of values in a set will fall within 1 standard deviation of the average. 95% of values fall within 2. 99.7% fall within 3. Here is a chart of every BBFL performance of all time based on average points per game. The higher the y-coordinate, the more common the value. Nearly 1,000 individual seasons. And all the way over here is Mahomes' 2022. For comparison, here's 2022 runner-up Josh Allen. Still not convinced? Here is every final WAR from across the BBFL. Down here is Mahomes in 2022, and way back here is Allen. I'll do you one better. Here's Lamar Jackson's 35.8 points per game in 2024, right next to Mahomes. And here's Jackson's WAR for that year, which I'll remind you again is the 10th best WAR in BBFL history. Alright, back from number 10 to number 1. Looking over all these numbers, Mahomes' 2022 saw a tie for the second lowest average points per game for quarterbacks in the past 10 years, and the difference in scoring between the first and second rated quarterbacks was second highest over the same time period. All of which is to say that not only was Mahomes excelling at his position like none other, his competition was uncharacteristically out of step for the MVP and the bane of James's existence. Any way you spin it, he's the GOAT. Which I find amusing, as Sam is probably the least likely member of the league to ever sit down and watch this monstrosity of a film. If you're out there, Sam, congrats on nabbing the GOAT. Let us know what it feels like. And that's about it. What more is there to say? After a decade plus and nearly 1,000 performances, these are the absolute titans of BBFL history. Many of these men are retired, and while some sit in the hallowed halls of the BBFL Hall of Fame, many more will hopefully be entering soon. This is all only made possible by the continued passion of our league's managers for the past 14 years and counting. Many leagues would have crumbled ages ago, members going their separate ways and never speaking again. I'm exceptionally grateful to have been a founding member of this league, and just to be a member at all. Whenever I talk to outsiders about the league, they inevitably ask what the stakes are, and I get a quiet satisfaction from their quizzical look when I say nothing, just the trophy and bragging rights. We're not here to win money or prizes. We're here to challenge each other to be better managers, to prove our mettle on the fantasy gridiron, and do our damnedest to keep James from winning it all again. Thank you all for 14 glorious years of fantasy football, and here's the 14 more. See you in 3 years for the next film.